I didn't really plan to spend the night in that place. It was one of those stupid dares that escalates way too far. It was a stormy Friday night and the kind of weather that seemed to carry all the cliches of a horror movie. Thunder cracked across the sky, and the rain slammed against my car windshield as I pulled into the long driveway that led up to the old house. We called it the McAllister House, though no one I knew actually remembered the people who used to live there. The house had been abandoned for decades. Its windows were boarded up, but some of the wood had fallen off over the years, leaving black, gaping holes that felt like empty eyes. The front porch sagged under years of neglect, and the whole place seemed swallowed by darkness, except for brief flashes of lightning that made the house seem to flicker to life, only to die again moments later. I remember thinking it was just a stupid dare. Go inside, spend a few hours, and prove to my friends that I wasn't a coward. It was just supposed to be fun. But when I reached for my flashlight, my fingers trembled slightly, and I couldn't tell if it was the cold or just something inside me that sensed what was to come. Pushing the front door open took a surprising amount of effort, but it gave way with a loud groan that echoed unnaturally through the empty halls. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness in a narrow cone, revealing dusty furniture and cobweb-covered corners. The air was thick, musty, and I took a moment to breathe in, steadying myself. I kept telling myself that the worst thing I'd encounter was some raccoons or maybe bats. No big deal, right? But there was something else, a feeling I couldn't shake. It was as if the very house were watching me. That sensation of eyes tracing every move, even in a place devoid of life. It started with something small, like the wind whistling through cracks in the window frames, sounding eerily like whispers. I shook it off. The wind, I told myself, was playing tricks on me. But it was hard to ignore that feeling crawling up my spine, urging me to turn back. I made my way down the main hallway, each step crunching over broken glass and debris. The noise louder than I'd expected, almost too loud. I stopped in front of an old mirror leaning against the wall. The surface was smudged and cracked, but as I moved the flashlight, I thought for a split second I saw something. A shadow? A figure standing right behind me? I spun around quickly, the light swinging wildly, but there was nothing there. Just empty, dusty air. My heart pounded, my skin prickled with cold sweat. I had to take a few deep breaths, reminding myself again, just my imagination. I decided to check out the living room next. It was the largest room in the house, dominated by a decrepit fireplace that had long since turned cold. I moved closer, almost fascinated by the intricate carvings on the mantelpiece. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from behind me. They weren't my own. My feet were planted firmly on the ground, and the sound was deliberate, each step slow, almost testing the weight of the creaking floorboards. I froze, and the air turned thick with tension. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to leave, but instead I turned around slowly, flashlight pointed down the hallway. The beam revealed nothing but darkness stretching into the distance. I swallowed, the lump in my throat making it hard to breathe. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and foolish against the oppressive quiet. No answer, just the faint whistle of wind and the deep groan of the old house settling. I waited, the seconds dragging on, and I could feel the pressure behind my eyes, like I was holding my breath for an answer that would never come. I shook my head, forcing myself to move. I was not going to be scared off by what was probably just echoes of my own steps. I stepped further into the house, brushing cobwebs from my face as I went, feeling them cling to my fingers. As I reached the far end of the hallway, there was a door on my right, a small one, leading down to the basement. I hadn't planned on exploring down there, but as I passed it, the door creaked open slowly, as if someone had gently pushed it from the other side. Every rational thought in my head was screaming at me to leave it alone, but curiosity is a funny thing. With shaky hands, I reached out, pulling the door open all the way. It revealed a staircase descending into complete blackness. The air coming from the basement was colder, carrying the unmistakable smell of damp earth and mold. I shivered, shining my light down, seeing nothing but the wooden steps vanishing into the void below. A noise came from the darkness, soft, like a faint whisper. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. urgent, almost pleading. My instincts flared, and I took a step back, bumping against the wall. I laughed nervously to myself, trying to dispel the tension. It had to be some kind of draft making those noises, I thought, something bouncing off the walls in weird ways. But then I heard it again, this time louder, like someone whispering just inches from my ear, the words incomprehensible but the tone unmistakably human. I felt a chill spread across my back and down my arms, goosebumps rising under my jacket. I slammed the door shut, turning the rusted key that was still in the lock. Whatever was down there, I wanted it to stay there. I stepped back, moving to head back to the main hallway. But then all of a sudden, without warning, the flashlight flickered. The light, my only comfort in the deep darkness, sputtered twice before going out entirely, leaving me in complete blackness. The darkness swallowed everything so thoroughly that it felt like I had lost all sense of direction. I was frozen in place, trying to steady my breath, my mind racing through what I could do. I fumbled in my pocket, pulling out my phone, grateful that I had at least that as a backup light. But before I could turn on the screen, I heard it again. The footsteps, only this time, they were closer, louder. The sound of shoes moving over the old wood, each step deliberate, moving toward me. It felt like the air was being sucked out of the room, and my chest grew tight. I finally managed to turn on my phone's flashlight, the screen flaring to life, blinding me momentarily. I swung the light around wildly, my breath coming in short gasps. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps hadn't stopped. They were behind me now, moving slowly, purposefully. I turned and saw nothing. No one was there, but I felt it, the presence, the unmistakable feeling that someone, something, was standing right there, just out of sight. My skin crawled, and I felt a scream welling up inside, but I kept it down, trying to keep my composure. And then, something even worse happened. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the old mirror down the hall. I turned my phone light toward it, and for a split second, I saw it. A shape, a dark figure standing in the reflection, though nothing was there in the hallway itself. The shape seemed to sway slightly, almost like it was mocking me, waiting. The whispering started again, louder this time, a voice that seemed to come from every direction, echoing in my ears. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone chilled me to the core. My fingers were numb, barely able to keep a hold on my phone as I stumbled backward, heart pounding. The whispers seemed to rise, overlapping, a chaotic rush of voices that seemed to urge me toward something, toward the basement door. The key in the door rattled, and I watched in horror as it turned by itself, the door slowly creaking open once more. Cold air rushed out, and the voices seemed to be calling from below now, beckoning, pleading. I shook my head, stepping back, my whole body shaking. No, no, I muttered, backing away, trying to will my legs to move faster. Suddenly there was a crash from upstairs, a loud, bone-rattling noise, as if something heavy had been thrown across a room. It startled me enough that I stumbled, falling backward onto the dusty floor. My phone slipped from my grasp, the light spinning wildly before it went out again, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled on the floor, hands shaking, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I found the phone, fumbling to turn it on, when I felt it. A hand, cold and unmistakably real, resting on my shoulder. I screamed, spinning around, but again, there was nothing there. The door to the basement, now wide open, seemed to yawn at me, the darkness almost alive. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the flashlight flickered back to life. The narrow beam cut through the oppressive blackness, revealing nothing but the empty hallway and the open basement door. My pulse raced, my throat dry, as I struggled to my feet. Every inch of me wanted to run, to escape that awful place, but the whispers from the basement were relentless, calling me, urging me closer, like a dark lullaby I couldn't ignore. I backed away from the door, my legs shaky, my breath shallow. The urge to flee was almost unbearable. I took a step back, but the house had other plans. With a loud crash, the front door at the end of the hallway slammed shut. The bang reverberated through the walls, echoing until it seemed to be pounding inside my head. I turned and ran toward it, my heart hammering so loudly I could hardly hear anything else. The door wouldn't budge. I pulled at the knob, twisted it, slammed my shoulder into the wood, but it was like the house had swallowed me whole and refused to let go. Panic surged through me. I turned the flashlight back toward the hallway, the basement door still open, the darkness almost breathing in and out like something alive. Suddenly, a light appeared at the top of the stairs, deep in the darkness of the basement, a tiny flickering glow like a candle flame, swaying gently as though it was calling to me. My feet moved before I had the chance to think, drawn to it. It was almost hypnotic, the way the light danced, beckoning me closer, even as my mind screamed to run, to get away from whatever waited down there. Step by step, I found myself approaching the basement door, the whispers growing louder. My hands shook as I grabbed the railing, the wood brittle and soft with age. The first step groaned under my weight, and I could feel the damp air envelop me, the stench of mold making my stomach turn. Still, that flickering light called me, deeper and deeper. Each step seemed to take a lifetime, the whispering louder, echoing in my ears like a chant. The cold seeped into my bones, and I could feel the fear clawing at my chest, making it hard to breathe. I reached the bottom, the light just ahead, an old flickering candle sitting on the dirt floor. I bent down, my hand trembling as I reached for it. The flame flickered again, and in that split second I felt something behind me. The whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, rasping breath, so close that I could feel the cold air against the back of my neck. The candle flickered out, plunging me back into darkness. I turned, my flashlight barely holding on, the beam jittery and weak, and that's when I saw them. Faces, so many faces, staring at me from the darkness. They weren't fully there, just shapes, impressions of eyes, mouths twisted in silent screams. They moved closer, surrounding me, their forms shimmering in the dim light. I stumbled back, my foot slipping on the uneven dirt, and I fell, landing hard on my back. They closed in, and in that moment I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. The whisper started again, not pleading this time, but mournful. I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel them. Loss, pain, and a terrible loneliness that seemed to crush the air out of my lungs. My vision blurred, tears stinging my eyes, and I gasped for breath, struggling against the suffocating weight of those unseen eyes. I don't know how, but I managed to get to my feet, my body moving on pure instinct. I stumbled through the dark, my hands reaching blindly for the stairs. The whispering followed, the faces moving with me, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I reached the stairs and climbed, each step a battle, my legs heavy and my chest aching with fear. I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the top, I slammed the basement door shut behind me, the echo of the bang reverberating through the empty house. I turned the key, locking whatever was down there away. My flashlight flickered again, and I could feel the tears on my face, though I didn't remember crying. My hands shook as I gripped the doorframe, trying to steady myself. Then everything went still. The house seemed to hold its breath, the whispers fading into silence. For a moment, I thought it was over, that whatever had haunted the basement was trapped, locked away. I turned, my flashlight aimed down the hallway, the beam steady now, and that's when I saw it, at the far end of the hallway, in the cracked old mirror. My reflection was there, but it wasn't right. The figure in the mirror was smiling, a wide, twisted grin that spread across its face. My own face, but wrong, the eyes dark and empty. My heart stopped and I stared, frozen in place. The reflection raised its hand, waving slowly, almost mockingly, and then it turned, walking out of view. I spun around, the hallway behind me empty. I could feel my body trembling, my mind barely able to comprehend what I had just seen. With a burst of adrenaline, I ran. I didn't care about anything else. My only thought was to get out, to escape that nightmare. I charged at the front door, throwing all my weight against it, and this time, it burst open. The storm outside was still raging, the wind howling and the rain lashing at my face as I stumbled out onto the porch, nearly slipping on the wet wood. I didn't look back. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I tore down the driveway, the tires skidding on the wet gravel. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, the old house disappearing behind me, swallowed by the rain and darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw something, someone standing on the porch, watching me leave. A dark figure, barely visible in the storm, just standing there. I didn't slow down. I drove until the house was far behind, until the whispers in my ears were drowned out by the roar of the rain and the hum of the engine. Even now, days later, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of that house. Sometimes, when the room is quiet, I think I can still hear the whispering, faint and distant, just at the edge of my hearing. And every time I pass by a mirror, I catch myself hesitating, afraid of what I might see looking back at me. They say that houses like that are haunted by memories, by echoes of the past, by people who lived and died within their walls. But I think it's something worse. I think it's not just the house that's haunted. I think it's me. And as the nights grow longer, I find myself dreading the dark, dreading the moment when I have to turn off the lights and face my own reflection, dreading the whispers that seem to grow louder each night. Because now I realize, whatever was in that house, it's not done with me yet. You ever wake up in the middle of the night and just know something's wrong? Like, it wasn't a sound or anything waking you, just that uneasy feeling crawling up your spine. That's what happened to me at my friend Ethan's sleepover. It was one of those typical weekends. I think we were maybe 12, 13 at the time. You know the drill. Too much junk food, video games until our eyes burned, and way too many ghost stories before we even thought of sleeping. Ethan's house was old, creaky, and a bit out of the way, which made it perfect for a sleepover that had a little extra spook factor. It was surrounded by dense woods, with barely any neighbors nearby. Exactly the kind of place you wouldn't want to be if things got scary. But hey, at the time, that just seemed to make the whole thing more exciting. There were 4 of us: Ethan, me, a guy named Nate, and Ethan's cousin, Jeremy. We ended up crashing in the living room, sprawled across sleeping bags, pillows, and blankets in that cluttered, chaotic way that sleepovers go. Ethan's parents were upstairs, and they'd long gone to bed. The only light came from a dim lamp in the corner, which we left on because none of us wanted to admit we didn't really like the dark after telling each other ghost stories all night. It must have been close to 3 in the morning when I woke up. It wasn't one of those gentle, half-conscious awakenings either. I just suddenly opened my eyes, wide awake. The air felt wrong, heavy, cold, and there was this strange tension, like the silence had been sharpened. I could hear the wind gently tapping against the window and the soft rustling of the trees outside. I sat up slowly, trying not to make too much noise, and that's when I noticed Jeremy. He wasn't in his sleeping bag. Instead, he was standing near the window, looking out into the dark. At first, I thought he might just be staring at something, maybe caught in that weird sleepy daze you sometimes get. But then I realized he was talking. It wasn't loud enough for me to make out the words, but there was this low, almost murmuring conversation happening. I squinted, my eyes adjusting to the dimness, and saw that he wasn't just talking to himself. There was someone standing outside. The window was one of those older types, with big panes and a flimsy lock. The guy outside was tall, lanky, and his face was just out of the light's reach, obscured by shadows. He was leaning in, like he was whispering something back to Jeremy. Everything about him seemed wrong, even from my vantage point on the floor. He was too still, too deliberate, like he was hyper-focused on Jeremy. I could see his arm reaching up, his long fingers almost pressing against the glass. Chills shot down my back. I knew immediately that this wasn't okay. There was something about the guy, something in the way he moved, or didn't move, that made my stomach twist. I tried to call out, but it was like my throat had closed up. I swallowed, forced myself to whisper, "Jeremy?" But he didn't even flinch. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake up the others. When I got closer, I heard the man outside, his voice soft but strangely commanding. He was saying, "Come on, Jeremy, just open the door. Just let me in. It's all right." And the weird part was, he sounded almost gentle, like he was coaxing a scared animal. Jeremy's hand moved to the latch on the window, his fingers trembling slightly as he began to fumble with it. I didn't think, I just reacted. I grabbed his arm and yanked him back hard. He stumbled, snapping out of whatever trance he'd been in, and finally turned to look at me, his eyes wide, confused. The man outside, he moved back, just enough that I could see his face for the first time. He had this empty smile, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, which were dark and hollow. The moment he saw me looking, that smile faded, replaced with something colder. He stepped back into the shadows and then just ran. Not in a normal way either. He moved almost like he was gliding, disappearing into the dark woods without a sound. I felt Jeremy trembling next to me. He whispered, What just happened?" But I didn't have an answer. I just shook my head and pulled him back to our sleeping spot, whispering that we'd talk in the morning. I didn't sleep much after that, and I don't think Jeremy did either. Every little sound, the wind, the creak of the old house, made me jump. The next morning, it felt almost surreal, like maybe I'd dreamt the whole thing. But Jeremy was quiet, his face pale, and he avoided looking at the window altogether. When Ethan asked us what was wrong, Jeremy just shrugged and mumbled something about having a bad dream. I wanted to tell them, but I figured it would sound too crazy. So I let it go, pretending like it was nothing. The day passed without much happening. We went outside, played some games, tried to act normal, but I kept feeling that weird, heavy sensation in the pit of my stomach, like we were being watched. I'd catch Jeremy glancing at the tree line, his eyes darting away, as soon as I looked over. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when Ethan's mom called us in for dinner, that Jeremy finally admitted it. He pulled me aside, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was someone from the neighborhood," he said. "Someone maybe one of Ethan's parents knew. He just looked at me like he knew me, like he was supposed to be there." I wanted to ask him more, but Ethan came up behind us then, dragging us back into the kitchen, and Jeremy went silent again. I could tell, though, he was still scared. And honestly, so was I. That night, Ethan's parents offered to let us sleep in the living room again, but Jeremy and I both made some excuse about sleeping upstairs. They must have thought it was weird, but they didn't argue. I ended up in Ethan's room with Jeremy on the floor next to me. It was a lot smaller than the living room, and somehow that made me feel safer, like there were fewer places for anything or anyone to hide. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling, trying not to think about the man's empty smile. I must have drifted off at some point, though, because I woke up suddenly again, this time to the sound of the wind rattling against the window. I tried to tell myself it was just the storm coming in, but then I heard it. That same voice, low and coaxing. Jeremy, just come let me in. It's all right." My heart stopped. I turned slowly, afraid of what I'd see, and there he was. Jeremy was sitting up in his sleeping bag, his eyes half open, staring at the window with that same glassy expression. The man outside, he was there again, his face almost pressed against the glass, smiling that hollow smile. His eyes flicked towards me, and his smile faded, replaced by something almost like anger. "Jeremy, no!" I shouted, lunging across the floor. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the nearest thing, Ethan's baseball bat, and swung it at the window, the loud crash waking everyone in the house. The glass shattered, the cold wind rushing in, and I heard Ethan's parents shouting from down the hall. The man outside stepped back quickly, his face twisting into something that looked almost disappointed, before he turned and vanished into the darkness again. Ethan's parents rushed in, confused, demanding to know what happened. We tried to explain, but I could tell they didn't really believe us. They thought we were just a bunch of kids who'd scared ourselves half to death. But they called the cops anyway, just to be safe. The officers who came out took a look around, found nothing but footprints in the mud outside, leading off into the woods. They said it was probably just some vagrant passing through, maybe a prank gone wrong. But I knew better. I knew that whoever or whatever that man was, he wasn't just passing through. That was the last sleepover we ever had at Ethan's house. His parents didn't let us stay over again, and honestly, none of us wanted to. For a while, I'd still wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to see that empty smile staring back at me through the window. And Jeremy? He never talked about it again. He moved away not long after. His family relocated for his dad's job or something like that. I haven't seen him in years. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind's just right and the house feels too quiet, I swear I hear that voice again. Soft, gentle, coaxing. Just let me in. It's all right. And every time, I get that same chill up my spine, the same sense that if I look out the window, I might see those hollow eyes staring back at me, waiting. I tried to shake it off as a bad memory, a trick my mind was playing on me. But things never went back to normal, not really. Even now, I still can't shake the feeling that there's something unfinished, like I didn't quite escape whatever was out there that night. After Ethan moved away for high school, we all drifted apart. It wasn't a dramatic break or anything, just the way things happen when you get older. Life goes on. But every now and then, I'd think back to that sleepover, to Jeremy standing at the window with his hand reaching for the latch. What scared me most was that look on his face, the one that said he thought the man outside was supposed to be there. Like he knew him, trusted him, even though every instinct I had told me to run. I couldn't understand how he could feel that way, how he could be so easily pulled in. A few years later, I was in my first year of college, far away from the sleepy little town where I'd grown up. I figured a change of scenery might be enough to finally put the past behind me. For a while, it worked. The noise of campus life, the classes, the new friends, I lost myself in all of it, and for a few months, I managed to forget. Until one day, I got a message. It was from Ethan, and it was short, just a link to an old local news story and the words, "Hey, remember this?" I almost ignored it. It wasn't like Ethan to send stuff like that out of the blue, but I hadn't heard from him in so long, I thought maybe it was some inside joke. When I opened the link, it was an article from our hometown newspaper. It was dated not long after our sleepover at Ethan's house. Apparently, a few days after we had our scare, a neighbor, someone who lived on the edge of those same woods, had called in a report about a strange man outside her house. She described him in a way that made my heart race, tall, lanky, with a smile that looked all wrong. The article said they'd searched the woods, even called in dogs, but they hadn't found anything. No trace of him, no signs of where he'd gone. It had been dismissed as an isolated incident, just some drifter who moved on. But reading it again, I couldn't help the way my stomach knotted up, the way my skin prickled. Someone else had seen him. Someone else had heard that voice, seen that hollow smile. I wanted to talk to Jeremy, but by then, I didn't even know where he was. We hadn't stayed in touch, and his family had moved again, further away. For some reason, the idea of him being gone like that made me feel uneasy, like maybe he was still caught in that man's gaze somehow, still hearing his voice. I didn't want to admit that maybe I was too. Things were quiet for a while after that, but it was like the article had opened something inside me. I started seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye, just flickers, things moving that I couldn't quite catch. I'd hear the floor creak late at night, or the wind tapping against my window, and my heart would stop. I knew it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't help it. I started keeping the blinds closed at night, making sure every door, every window was locked before I went to bed. Then one night it happened again. I'd been studying late, staring at my laptop, eyes tired, barely staying awake. My roommate was out, and the apartment felt too quiet, too empty. I was just about to call it a night when I heard it. A soft tap, tap tap, like fingers against glass. I froze, my eyes flicking to the window. I'd pulled the blinds shut, but even through them, I could see a faint shadow, someone standing there. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what I already knew was waiting for me. The tapping came again. Slower this time, more deliberate. I held my breath, feeling that cold dread I hadn't felt in years. I forced myself to get up, to walk towards the window, each step feeling like it was dragging me closer to something I wasn't sure I'd escape this time. When I finally reached it, I grabbed the cord for the blinds, paused for just a moment, then yanked them open. There was nothing there. No face, no shadow, just the empty night, the streetlights casting long, empty shadows over the parking lot below. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself it was just my imagination, just my tired brain messing with me. But then I saw it, down below, in the corner of the parking lot, just at the edge of the light, there was movement. Someone stepping back into the shadows, their face turned up towards me. It was just a glimpse, just a flash, but I knew it was him. I knew it the same way I'd known that night at Ethan's, that deep, gut-wrenching certainty that something was wrong. He was still there. He'd never left. I pulled the blinds shut again, stepping back, trying to steady my breathing. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but who would believe me? Who would understand? I stayed up the rest of the night, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for that sound again, that soft, coaxing voice. But it never came. The next morning, I packed up. I told my roommate I was heading home for the weekend, that I needed a break from classes. He didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer any explanations. I just knew I needed to get away, to go somewhere that felt safer, if only for a little while. I went back to my parents' house, to my old room, and tried to tell myself it was over, that whatever had happened, it was all in my head. But even there, surrounded by everything familiar, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The old floorboards creaked at night, the wind whispered against the window, and I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting. It was on the second night back home that I finally heard from Jeremy. He sent me a message out of nowhere, just a short, cryptic text. "Have you seen him too?" My hands were trembling as I typed back, "What do you mean?" The reply came almost immediately. "The man from the window. He's here." I felt my heart stop, my breath catching in my throat. I stared at the screen, at the words glowing in the dark, and I knew. It wasn't just me. He was still out there, still looking, still waiting for one of us to let him in. I tried calling Jeremy, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice shaky, telling him to be careful, to get somewhere safe. But I never heard back. I tried calling again the next day, and the day after that, but nothing. It was like he'd vanished, just like before. It's been months now since that message, and I still haven't heard from Jeremy. I don't know where he is, if he's okay, if he managed to get away. But I can't shake the feeling that I'm next, that it's only a matter of time before I wake up to that voice again, that soft, gentle whisper calling my name, asking me to let him in. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that first sleepover, about how close Jeremy came to opening that window. I think about how easy it would have been, how simple, just a flick of the latch, and that man would have been inside. And I wonder, if I hadn't woken up that night, would Jeremy have let him in? Would any of us have ever woken up again? Now every night before I go to bed, I check the locks. I make sure every window is closed, every door is bolted tight. I leave the blinds shut, and I keep a light on, just in case. But deep down, I know it doesn't matter, because he's still out there. And one day, he's going to come back. One day, I might not wake up in time. And when that day comes, I just hope I'm strong enough to not let him in. The days that followed became a blur of sleepless nights and exhausted days. I tried to resume my normal routine, but the anxiety clung to me like a second skin. Every night, I had to keep a small light on in the corner of my room, and I checked the locks obsessively, making sure every window was shut, every door bolted tight. But deep down, I knew it was all a temporary solution. The real problem was somewhere out there, beyond anything I could secure with locks and latches. I couldn't stop thinking about Jeremy. Since I got that last message from him, there had been nothing. No responses, no returned calls. It was as if he had just disappeared. The memory of that night at Ethan's house started to weigh on me more, and it no longer felt like a childhood nightmare I could just brush off. Jeremy's text was confirmation of the impossible. The man with the hollow eyes and empty smile was still out there, looking for us. One night, after weeks of pushing myself beyond the limits of fear, I decided I had to do something. I was tired of feeling like a prisoner in my own home, held hostage by a faceless shadow. I took out my laptop and searched for anything related to our hometown, focusing on strange occurrences, missing people, unexplained sightings. It was a long shot, but I needed some kind of closure, or maybe even a clue about what had happened to Jeremy. After hours of digging through old news articles, forums, and archives, I found something, a thread on a local urban legend forum. It was mostly full of half-believed ghost stories, the sort of stuff people talk about to give themselves a thrill, but one post caught my attention. It was dated a few weeks after our sleepover, and it talked about a tall, thin man spotted near the outskirts of town, just beyond the woods by Ethan's old neighborhood. The poster described the man as having a smile that seemed off, like it didn't belong on a human face. They said he'd been seen lingering outside houses late at night, just staring into windows. I felt my stomach twist as I read. It felt like someone had just confirmed everything I feared. I scrolled down, and I saw that others had commented, some dismissing it as a prank, others sharing their own vague sightings, stories of seeing someone in their backyard or glimpsing a figure out of the corner of their eye late at night. A few people mentioned that pets had gone missing in the neighborhood around the same time, as if something or someone had been silently moving through their lives, taking whatever it wanted. One comment at the bottom of the thread made my breath catch. It was from an anonymous user who said simply, "He knocks first, then he waits. If you see him, don't look away." It felt like a warning, or maybe advice from someone who had seen too much. I closed my laptop, feeling the familiar dread settling into my chest again. I couldn't ignore this. The truth was, he was real, and whatever he wanted, he wasn't done with us. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house made me flinch. I stared at the closed blinds, knowing that just beyond them could be that shadow, that man. I kept repeating to myself that I wouldn't look, that I wouldn't let him in, but the fear was relentless. It felt like I was teetering on the edge of something far darker than anything I'd ever faced. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it. Soft at first, almost hesitant, as if to test whether I was awake. Tap, tap, tap. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. My entire body was rigid, and the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I knew it was him. Somehow I knew. I tried to stay calm, tried to remember the comment from that forum, "If you see him, don't look away." But I hadn't looked yet, and I wondered if that was what he was waiting for. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like it was challenging me. I could feel my heart racing, pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. Slowly, I turned my head towards the window. I could see the outline of something through the blinds, just a shadow, unmoving, waiting. My instincts were screaming at me to do something, anything. Turn on the lights, run, yell for help, but I felt frozen. The next moment, the tapping stopped, and in the sudden silence, I heard it, the voice. It was soft, almost too soft to hear, like a whisper carried by the wind. "Let me in," it said. "Just let me in. It's all right." The words were almost comforting, but there was something underneath them, something dark and hollow. I clenched my fists, trying to fight the overwhelming urge to stand up, to walk to the window. It felt like a magnet was pulling me towards it, drawing me closer, closer to that voice, that promise of something that I knew was wrong. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the blinds, fighting myself. The voice repeated, "Just open the window. It's all right. I can help you." Each word was like a knife slipping deeper into my mind, prying at my fear and my exhaustion. It was relentless, patient, as if it knew eventually I'd give in. But then something broke the spell. A sudden noise from the hallway. The sound of my mom's door opening, the creak of the old wood. The spell shattered, and I snapped back into myself. I bolted upright, stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my ears. I heard my mom call out, sleepy and confused, asking if everything was all right. I ran to the door, flung it open, and called back that I was fine, my voice shaky. I turned on every light I could reach, flooding the room with brightness, pushing back the shadows. My mom stood in the hallway, her face concerned, but I couldn't explain it to her. I just said I'd had a nightmare, that everything was fine now. She nodded, gave me a strange look, and then went back to her room. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, before I finally turned back to the window. Slowly, I stepped closer, my hands trembling. I reached out, grabbed the cord for the blinds, and yanked them open. There was nothing there, just the empty street, the wind rustling the branches of the trees, the distant glow of a streetlight. But I knew what I had heard. I knew he had been there, waiting. Since that night, I've tried to figure out what to do next. Part of me wants to run, to go somewhere far away, somewhere he can't find me. But another part of me knows it doesn't matter where I go. He'll follow. He'll always follow. Because it's not about the place. It's about me, about Jeremy, about anyone else he's ever visited. I think he's waiting for something, waiting for me to be weak, waiting for me to give in. And the scariest part is, I don't know how much longer I can hold out. Each time I hear that tap at the window, each time I hear that soft voice whispering, I feel myself getting closer to the edge, closer to opening the blinds, to unlatching the window, to letting him in. and I'm scared that one night I won't be able to stop myself. One night, I'll hear that voice and it'll be too much. I'll open the window and he'll finally get what he wants. And when that happens, I just hope someone else out there knows what to do, because I'm starting to realize that this isn't just about me or Jeremy. It's about something bigger, something dark that's creeping into the corners of people's lives, waiting for that one weak moment, that one crack in the armor. If you ever hear the tapping at your window, if you ever hear that voice, just remember, don't look, don't listen, and whatever you do, don't let him in. You know how sleepovers are supposed to be fun, full of movies, snacks, and staying up way past your bedtime? Well, I wish that's all I had to say about my sleepover at Max's house. But that night, it was anything but normal. Sometimes I still think about it when I'm lying awake, and no matter how many times I tell myself it was all in my head, I can't shake the feeling that something real happened. I was 8 years old when it happened, and it was a Friday night, one of those nights that felt like freedom, when the whole weekend stretched out in front of you. Max and I had spent the entire afternoon playing video games, eating junk food, and just goofing off like kids do. His parents were super nice, and they let us turn the living room into our own little fortress of blankets and pillows. Everything was great, and I remember feeling so excited to finally sleep over at my best friend's place. By the time it got late, Max's mom had already gone upstairs. She'd kissed Max goodnight and reminded us, no staying up too late, you two. His dad was the last to go up. He'd stayed to help us pick out a movie to watch, something just scary enough to feel thrilling, but not terrifying. We picked Gremlins, which was perfect for that cozy, slightly creepy vibe. After a while, it was just me and Max, sitting there in the glow of the TV. The living room was dark, except for the flickering light, and the rest of the house was almost completely quiet. Outside, the wind was starting to pick up, making the trees sway. I could hear the branches brushing against the windows, and every now and then, they'd make a noise like fingernails tapping on glass. It should have just been a fun sleepover, a night full of laughs and snacks, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, just this weird feeling like the air was too thick or the shadows were too long. It was after the movie ended that things started getting strange. Max had already dozed off halfway through the credits, his head buried under the pillow to block out the bright blue of the TV screen. I wasn't tired, though. I was still wired, maybe from all the sugar, maybe from the thrill of being somewhere other than my own room. I lay there on the floor, wrapped up in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling. And that's when I heard it, a sound from the garage. It was this metallic clunk, followed by a soft mechanical whir, like a motor running. I turned my head toward the hallway that led to the garage door, frowning. It wasn't loud, but in the stillness of the night, it seemed to echo. I sat up, listening harder. The noise came again, and I realized it was the sound of the garage door opening. My first thought was that Max's dad had gone out to get something. But that didn't make sense. Why would he be going into the garage in the middle of the night? The more I thought about it, the stranger it felt. I nudged Max, shaking his shoulder. "Hey, Max," I whispered. "Wake up." Max mumbled something, his eyes still closed. I shook him again, a little harder this time. "Max, wake up. I think someone's in the garage." That got his attention. His eyes snapped open, and he sat up, squinting at me through the dim light. "What? No way," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. I could tell he was trying to shake off sleep, but there was a hint of nervousness in his voice. "Maybe it's just my dad." "I don't think so," I whispered. "It sounds weird." Max sighed, but I could tell he was curious too. He glanced toward the hallway, then back at me. "All right, let's check it out," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. There was a hint of bravery in him, that kind of bravery only kids have, the kind that lets you face the darkness even when you're terrified. We slipped out of our sleeping bags, moving as quietly as we could. The living room suddenly felt way too dark, and the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. Max led the way, and I followed close behind, trying not to make any noise as we crept down the hall. We reached the door that led to the garage, and Max hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. He looked back at me, his eyes wide. I nodded, swallowing hard. Max took a deep breath and turned the knob, slowly pushing the door open. The garage was dark, but I could see the faint outline of the car and the shelves lining the walls. The air smelled like oil and dust, that familiar garage smell, but there was something else, a strange, almost metallic tang that I didn't recognize. The door to the outside, the one that connected the garage to the driveway, was half open, the cold night air blowing in, making the hairs on my arms stand up. For a second, nothing moved. I thought maybe we'd just imagined it, that we'd find nothing but an empty garage and laugh about how silly we'd been. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, slipping out through the open garage door, disappearing into the night. My breath caught in my throat, and I grabbed Max's arm, squeezing it tight. He looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Max nodded, his face pale. We backed away, our eyes still locked on the open door, half expecting the shadow to come back. The cold wind blew in harder, rustling the tools hanging on the wall, making the whole garage feel like it was alive. I wanted to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The fear was paralyzing, like my body had forgotten how to move. Max snapped out of it first. We need to get my dad," he whispered, his voice trembling. He turned, pulling me with him, and we ran back into the house, our footsteps loud against the hardwood floor. We pounded up the stairs, not caring if we woke the whole house. Max burst into his parents' room, his voice cracking as he called for his dad. Dad, wake up!" His father sat up, his eyes bleary with sleep, looking confused. "Max, what's going on?" he asked, his voice thick. There's someone in the garage," Max said, his voice shaking. His dad's expression changed immediately, the sleepiness replaced by alarm. He got up, pulling on a robe, and headed down the stairs, telling us to stay put. We stood at the top of the stairs, watching as he made his way to the garage, his figure getting smaller and smaller in the dim light of the hallway. Max's mom came up behind us, her hand on Max's shoulder. "What happened?" she asked, her voice full of worry. Max tried to explain, but the words came out in a rush, almost too fast to understand. We heard the garage door creak open, and then silence. A long, heavy silence that seemed to stretch on forever. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, and I could feel the sweat on my palms. I held my breath, waiting. Finally, Max's dad came back, his face serious. He looked at us, then at his wife. "There's no one there," he said. "The garage door must have been left open by mistake. But it's all locked up now. Everything's fine." He tried to sound reassuring, but I could see the tension in his face. Max and I exchanged a glance, and I could tell he wasn't convinced either. There was something in the way his dad spoke, something that told me he was trying to believe what he was saying, even if he didn't fully believe it himself. We went back to the living room, but neither of us could sleep. We lay there in our sleeping bags, staring at the ceiling, the flickering shadows cast by the wind moving through the trees outside. Every little creak, every rustle of the house settling made me jump. I could tell Max was just as scared as I was, his eyes wide open in the dark. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again, the faint, unmistakable sound of a door handle rattling. It was coming from the garage. My eyes snapped open, and I turned my head toward Max. He was staring at me, his eyes wide, his face pale. We didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. We both knew what we'd heard. The rattling continued, soft but persistent, like someone or something was trying to get in. The door was locked, but the sound didn't stop. It went on for what felt like forever, each click of the handle echoing through the dark living room, sending chills down my spine. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, my heart racing. I wanted to wake Max's parents, to scream for help, but I couldn't move. I was too scared, too afraid that if I made a sound, whatever was on the other side of that door would hear me. Eventually, the rattling stopped. Just like that, it was over. The silence that followed was somehow worse, like the whole house was holding its breath, waiting. I listened for what felt like hours, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, whispers, the creak of a floorboard, but there was nothing. Just the wind outside and the sound of Max breathing next to me, shallow and fast. Neither of us moved. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, staring at the ceiling, our ears tuned to every noise. I kept thinking about the shadow we'd seen slipping out of the garage, the way it had moved so quickly, so silently. It didn't make any sense. Max's dad had locked the door, I knew that, but why had it rattled after that? And why did it feel like something was still out there, waiting? Somehow, despite the fear, exhaustion must have won out, because I must have fallen asleep at some point. When I woke up, it was morning. The sunlight was streaming in through the curtains, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself that it had all been a bad dream. But then I looked over at Max, and he looked back at me, and I knew we'd both experienced the same thing. Max's dad came down, acting like nothing had happened. He made us breakfast, pancakes with chocolate chips like he always did on weekends, and tried to make small talk, asking if we'd had fun, if we wanted to go play outside. I could tell he was trying to keep things normal, but there was this tightness in his smile, like he didn't quite believe his own words. Max and I just nodded, barely saying a word. The memory of the night was too fresh, the fear too close to the surface. After breakfast, Max and I went out into the backyard. It was a bright, clear day, the kind of crisp autumn morning where the sky is so blue it almost hurts to look at. The wind had died down, and the trees stood still, their leaves shining gold and orange in the sunlight. But even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It was like a shadow that clung to me, reminding me of the night before. Max didn't say much either. He kicked at a pile of leaves, his eyes distant, like he was trying to piece together what had happened. Finally, he looked at me. "Do you think it was just our imagination?" he asked, his voice quiet. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him it was all just a weird dream, that we'd scared ourselves for no reason. But I couldn't. I shook my head, looking back at the house, my eyes lingering on the door to the garage. "I don't know," I said, "but it felt real." Max nodded, not saying anything. We stood there for a while, the silence stretching out between us, both of us lost in our thoughts. Eventually, Max's mom called us in for lunch, and we went back inside, but the feeling of unease never left. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We tried to play video games, tried to watch cartoons, but neither of us could focus. There was this tension in the house, this strange energy that made it impossible to relax. Max's parents acted like everything was normal, but I could see the way they exchanged glances when they thought we weren't looking, the way they kept checking the locks, making sure everything was secure. That night, I was supposed to sleep over again, but I couldn't do it. I made up an excuse, told Max that I wasn't feeling well, that I wanted to go home. He didn't argue, he just nodded like he understood, like he felt the same way. Max's mom called my parents and they came to pick me up. I remember the relief I felt when I saw our car pull into the driveway, the way my mom smiled at me when I climbed into the back seat. As we drove away, I looked back at Max's house. It looked so normal, so peaceful in the fading light of the evening. But I knew better. I knew that something had happened there, something that none of us could explain. That night, as I lay in my own bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The shadow, the rattling door, the way the cold air had blown into the garage. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to make sense of it, but there were no answers. Just questions that seemed to get bigger and scarier the more I thought about them. For weeks after that, I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise would jolt me awake, my heart pounding, my mind going back to that garage door and the shadow slipping away. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, listening for the faintest sound of movement. It was like I was waiting for something to happen, even though I didn't know what. Max and I didn't talk about it again. Not really. We went back to school, back to our routines, but there was this unspoken thing between us, this understanding that we'd shared something terrifying, something that we couldn't explain. We still hung out, still played video games, and rode our bikes around the neighborhood, but we never had another sleepover at his house. Not after that night. One day, a few months later, I finally asked Max if his parents had ever figured out what happened. He just shrugged, his face serious. "They said it was probably just the wind," he said. "That maybe the garage door didn't close all the way, and that's why it opened on its own." I nodded, but I could tell Max didn't believe it, and neither did I. It was too neat of an answer, too simple. Whatever we'd seen that night, whatever had tried to come in through the garage, It wasn't just the wind. Years later, I still think about that night sometimes. I think about the way the garage door had been half open, the shadow moving through the darkness, the rattling handle. It's a memory that sticks with you, even when you try to forget it. And sometimes, late at night, when I hear a strange noise, like a door creaking or a soft knock, I still get that same chill down my spine, that same feeling that maybe something is out there waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it never really left. The rumbling of the truck's engine was the only sound breaking the silence of the Nevada night. It was an older model, a sturdy beast of a vehicle that had been loyal to the two brothers for years of long-haul jobs. Joe, the younger of the two, was at the wheel, while Tom sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the seemingly endless expanse of desert. The landscape outside was bleak, a wasteland of dark earth beneath a sky full of stars that seemed too distant to care. They were hauling a load of construction materials to a site in California, a typical late-night job that paid well for those willing to brave the eerie emptiness of rural Nevada. Joe's eyes were fixed ahead, the headlights cutting a narrow swath through the pitch-black night, while Tom absent-mindedly sipped his lukewarm coffee. The brothers had always been close, growing up together in a small Arizona town, sharing in the same adventures and mischiefs of youth. But out here, something felt different. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, a strange absence of life that seemed to wrap itself around them as they drove deeper into the night. Suddenly, Tom straightened in his seat, squinting into the darkness. "Joe, slow down a bit," Tom said, his voice low and uncertain. Joe eased off the gas, frowning. "What's up? I thought I saw something, just up ahead, near the road." Joe peered into the darkness, and then he saw it too. A shape, indistinct, moving along the side of the road. It was large, maybe the size of a deer, but the way it moved was all wrong. The creature seemed to slink rather than walk, its limbs long and angular. "What the hell is that?" Joe muttered. As they got closer, the shape came into view. It looked like a coyote, at least at first glance. But it was bigger, much bigger. Its fur was matted and patchy, and it had eyes that glowed a sickly yellow in the light of the truck's high beams. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing a row of sharp, uneven teeth. What made both men shiver, though, was the sound. It screamed. The noise was like nothing they had ever heard, a high-pitched wail that seemed to echo across the desert, almost like a woman's scream mixed with the furious yowl of a dying animal. Joe's heart hammered in his chest, and his foot instinctively pressed down harder on the gas pedal. "Jesus, did you hear that?" Tom's voice trembled, his eyes locked on the creature as they sped past. Yeah, I heard it," Joe said, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. "What the hell was that thing?" They drove in silence for a moment, the tension in the cab thick enough to cut. Tom twisted in his seat to look back through the rear window. The creature was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the desert. "Probably just some sick animal," Joe said, trying to steady his breathing, but there was doubt in his voice. Tom nodded, but he didn't look convinced. "I don't know, Joe, it looked wrong." Joe didn't reply. He just focused on the road ahead, pushing the truck faster. But the quiet was broken again, this time by a noise above them. A heavy thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping across metal. "Something's on the roof," Tom yelled, his face pale. Joe's eyes went wide as the truck swerved slightly. He fought to keep control as the weight above shifted, something pounding on the roof, moving towards the front of the cab. The metallic screeching grew louder, and the brothers could hear the labored, guttural breathing of the thing above them. "Get it off! Get it off!" Tom shouted, panic setting in. Joe's mind raced. The highway stretched out endlessly before them, and there was no sign of civilization, no place to stop. He swerved the truck sharply, hoping to throw the creature off balance. The beast let out another scream, this one angrier, more guttural, and Joe felt the truck rock under the sudden shift in weight. Suddenly, the creature lunged forward, its body slamming onto the hood of the truck. Joe caught a glimpse of its twisted form, its eyes glaring, its mouth open in an awful snarling grin. The headlights illuminated its face for just a moment, but it was enough to see that this was no ordinary animal. Its features were distorted, almost human, with a long snout, and eyes that seemed filled with rage and hunger. Tom reached for the glove compartment, yanking it open to reveal a revolver they kept for emergencies. His hands shook as he fumbled with the gun, finally managing to cock it. He rolled down the window, leaning out just enough to aim at the creature. "Hold steady, Joe," he yelled. Joe did his best to keep the truck straight, his eyes flicking between the road and the monster clawing at the hood. Tom squeezed the trigger, the gunshot echoing across the empty desert. The creature screeched, recoiling as the bullet hit its shoulder. For a moment it seemed to lose its grip, sliding slightly to the side. Joe took the chance. He swerved hard to the left, and with a final, angry wail, the creature was flung off the hood, disappearing into the darkness of the desert once more. Breathing heavily, Joe straightened the truck, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Tom quickly pulled himself back inside, slamming the window shut, his face ashen. Did we get it?" Tom asked, his voice barely a whisper. Joe shook his head, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. There was nothing but the road behind them, stretching into blackness. "I don't know," Joe said, "but we're not stopping to find out." They drove on, the tension slowly beginning to ease, though neither of them spoke. The night seemed to grow even darker, the road lonelier. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the pounding of their hearts. After what felt like hours, they saw the glow of lights in the distance, a small truck stop, a beacon of safety in the vast emptiness. Joe pulled in, parking the truck under the bright lights of the lot. Both men sat there for a moment, not speaking, just staring out at the lights, grateful to be somewhere that felt normal. Tom finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "What the hell was that thing, Joe?" Joe shook his head slowly. "I don't know, man. But whatever it wasn't natural." They climbed out of the truck, their legs unsteady beneath them. As they walked towards the small diner attached to the truck stop, Joe glanced back at the truck. There were deep scratches on the hood, long gouges that ran across the metal, proof that what they had seen was real. They didn't stay long at the diner, just enough to catch their breath and calm their nerves. When they finally got back on the road, the first light of dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. The desert seemed less threatening in the daylight, the shadows retreating as the sun rose. But neither of them would forget the creature, the way it screamed, the way it seemed to stare into their souls with those terrible, glowing eyes. They drove in silence, the memory of that night lingering, a chilling reminder that there were things out here in the vastness of the desert that defied explanation, things that waited for travelers who dared to cross their path. The sun had fully risen by the time Joe and Tom finally made it to the drop-off point in California. The job site was bustling with workers and machinery, the noise and activity a stark contrast to the isolation of the desert night. Joe pulled the truck into the designated area, the brothers both weary but relieved to have made it. "All right, let's get this done," Joe muttered, his voice rough from fatigue. They moved through the motions of unloading, both of them acutely aware of the deep gouges still visible on the truck's hood. They worked in silence, the creature's terrifying scream still echoing in their minds. After the job was done, Tom looked at Joe, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I think we should talk to someone about this. It can't just be us, right? Someone else must have seen it." Joe was hesitant. He knew Tom was right, but the thought of trying to explain what they'd seen to someone else made his stomach twist. It was the kind of thing that would get them laughed out of the room, truckers scared by some weird animal. And yet, there was a part of him that was desperate to know that they weren't alone in what they'd experienced. "All right," Joe said finally, his expression grim. "Let's ask around, but we have to be careful. No one's going to take us seriously if we come off like a couple of nut jobs." Tom nodded in agreement. After signing off on the delivery paperwork, they left the job site, the truck noticeably lighter. Tom suggested they head to a nearby diner, a place where they could sit, get a meal, and maybe find a few ears that might have heard similar tales. The diner they found was a small, worn-out building just off the main road, exactly the kind of place frequented by truckers and travelers. The bell above the door chimed as they walked in, the smell of grease and coffee instantly hitting them. A few people were scattered around, An old couple in a booth, two men at the counter, and a waitress who looked like she'd been on her feet all night. Joe and Tom took a seat at the counter, ordering coffee and breakfast from the weary waitress. As they waited, Tom glanced over at the two men sitting a few stools down. They looked like fellow truckers, worn denim, tired faces, that same weary look of men who spent too many hours behind the wheel. Tom leaned over, lowering his voice. "Hey fellas, you guys drive through Nevada often?" One of the men, a burly guy with a thick beard, turned to look at Tom. He narrowed his eyes, considering for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, sure. Just came through there a few nights ago. Why?" Tom exchanged a glance with Joe, then turned back to the man. "You ever see anything weird out there? Like an animal, or hear strange sounds?" The burly man frowned, his eyes darkening. The second man, a wiry fellow with a weathered face, gave a dry chuckle. "Weird? Hell, all of Nevada is weird, friend, but I know what you're getting at." Joe perked up, his heart skipping a beat. "You've seen something? Like a big coyote, or heard a scream?" The wiry man looked at the burly guy and then back at Joe and Tom. He leaned in, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "You boys ran into it, didn't ya? The thing with the scream." Joe felt a chill run down his spine. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, last night. It was on our truck." The burly man grunted, shaking his head. "Damn fools. You're lucky you're still breathing. We've heard stories about that thing. Truckers disappearing, people finding trucks abandoned out in the desert. It's been out there for years, some say decades." Tom swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. "What is it? Have you seen it?" The wiry man shrugged. "Never seen it myself, but I've heard the stories. Some say it's a skinwalker, a kind of Navajo witch that can turn into animals. Others say it's something older, something that's been out there since before any of us were around. All I know is, you hear that scream, you don't stop, you don't look, you get out of there as fast as you can." Joe rubbed a hand across his face, the weight of the man's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He thought of the thing's eyes, its terrible knowing gaze. He shivered. The waitress came by, dropping off their food and refilling their coffee, and the conversation shifted. The truckers paid their bill and left soon after, giving Joe and Tom a nod of acknowledgement, as if to say, "We know. Be careful." The rest of the day passed in a blur of exhaustion. They took turns driving, heading back home to Arizona. The conversation was sparse, both brothers lost in their own thoughts. The truck seemed quieter than usual, the road ahead a long, winding ribbon stretching endlessly before them. It wasn't until the sun began to dip below the horizon that Tom finally spoke. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Do you think it'll come back?" Joe glanced at him, then back at the road. He didn't know how to answer. There was a part of him that wanted to say no, that wanted to believe it was over. But there was another part of him, a deeper, instinctive part, that knew the truth. "If it does," Joe said finally, his voice rough, "we'll be ready." Tom nodded, his eyes drifting to the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at him. The darkness was creeping in again, swallowing the landscape, and with it came the memories of that terrible night. But there was something else too, a resolve, a determination not to be prey, not to be just another story told in hushed tones at truck stops. As they drove, the headlights of the truck cutting a path through the growing darkness, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of desert, the creature was still watching, waiting. The road ahead was long, and the night was coming fast. But Joe and Tom were ready. This time, they would not be taken by surprise. They continued on, the truck's engine a steady hum in the otherwise silent night, the darkness pressing in around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its cry carrying on the wind. Joe's hands tightened on the wheel, and he pushed the truck a little faster, his eyes locked on the road ahead, the sense of something lurking just out of sight always there. And behind them, in the shifting shadows of the desert, the creature moved, patient, relentless. It was not finished, not yet. You ever get that feeling that you're being watched? Like out of nowhere, you just know something is wrong? Well, that's exactly what happened to me that night in the cabin. And trust me, what I'm about to share still gives me chills, even now, weeks later. It was supposed to be just another work retreat, a chance to get away from all the noise of the city, but it ended up being a night I wish I could forget. I'd rented this cabin deep in the woods, beautiful, rustic, the kind of place you dream about when you're tired of the urban grind. It was late autumn, and the weather was cold enough to see your breath in the mornings. It had a quiet loneliness to it, but honestly, that's what I was looking for. A place where I could just paint without interruption. I didn't mind the isolation. At least that's what I thought at first. The first few days were wonderful. The trees around me were a burst of gold and red, and the cabin was surrounded by this forest that seemed to go on forever. The days were short, but I loved the twilight hours, when everything turned that deep blue color and the shadows stretched long across the clearing. The place was old, creaky, but in that comforting way, like it had a history. The fireplace crackled, and the scent of burning pine filled the air. It all seemed perfect. But it was the third night that everything went wrong. I was working late, pushing past midnight, trying to finish up a piece that had been eluding me. My studio was a makeshift setup in the living room, an easel, some brushes, my paint spread out on a wooden table. The only light in the room was a lamp, its glow pooling around me, while the rest of the cabin was bathed in shadows. The wind outside had picked up, whistling through the trees, and occasionally I'd hear branches tapping against the window. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the strokes of my brush. That's when I heard it, a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, like something shifting upstairs. I paused, the brush hovering over the canvas, and listened. Nothing, just the wind, I told myself. But a moment later, there it was again, a soft creak, like someone stepping on an old floorboard. My eyes drifted up to the ceiling, and my heart gave this weird little flutter. I shook my head, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Come on, Jacob, get it together," I muttered, trying to refocus. It's an old cabin. Old cabins make noise. But I couldn't quite shake that sense of unease, the feeling that maybe I wasn't alone. The next hour went by without incident. I tried to bury myself in my work, but I kept glancing toward the staircase, which led up to the loft and the attic beyond. The more I tried to ignore it, the more aware I became of every little sound. The wind outside, the creaking of the walls, the faint scratching, almost like nails against wood. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the beam cutting through the darkness, and slowly made my way up the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, and the air grew colder as I climbed. The loft was just a small landing with a door that led to the attic. I stood there for a moment, staring at that door, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. It felt ridiculous, like I was some character in a horror movie, about to do the exact thing the audience screams at them not to do. But I had to know. I reached out, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. The attic was pitch black, the kind of dark that makes you feel like you could get lost in it. I swept the flashlight across the space, dusty beams, old boxes, a couple of pieces of furniture draped in sheets. Nothing out of the ordinary. I let out a shaky laugh, relieved. Just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then, as I turned to head back down, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the shadows. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Slowly I turned back, the flashlight beam trembling as I swept it across the attic again. And then I saw it, a pair of eyes, reflecting the light, staring at me from the darkness. They were yellow, glowing, and as I focused on them I realized they were getting closer. The creature stepped into the beam, and I swear my heart stopped. It was tall, hunched, covered in matted fur that hung wetly from its body, like it had just crawled out of a swamp. Its face was twisted, almost human but not quite, with a snout that ended in sharp, yellowed teeth. Its claws clicked against the wooden floor as it moved, and it let out another growl, low and threatening. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. This was some kind of nightmare. But the creature was real, and it was moving toward me, its eyes locked on mine. Panic took over. I turned and bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. Behind me I could hear it. Heavy footsteps, the sound of claws scratching against the walls as it followed. I burst into the living room, my eyes darting around for something, anything, to defend myself with. My gaze landed on the paint sprayer I'd been using earlier, still half full. I grabbed it without thinking, turning just as the creature reached the bottom of the stairs. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment it paused, as if it was studying me. There was an intelligence there, a cruel curiosity. It knew I was afraid. I could feel it savoring that fear. With a shaky breath, I lifted the sprayer and pulled the trigger. A burst of paint shot out, splattering across the creature's face. It let out this horrible, strangled howl, stumbling back as it tried to wipe the paint from its eyes. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran for the door, my heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to get out, get as far away as I could. I burst out into the cold night air, the wind whipping against my face. I ran, my feet crunching over the fallen leaves, not daring to look back. The forest was a blur around me, the trees towering like dark sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind. I didn't know where I was going, just away, as far away from that cabin as I could get. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a road, a narrow, winding thing that cut through the forest. I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath, my entire body trembling. I looked back, half expecting to see the creature charging after me, but there was nothing, just the darkness of the woods, silent and still. Eventually, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. A truck, its engine rumbling as it approached. I stumbled to my feet, waving my arms, and the driver, a middle-aged guy with a kind face, stopped, his eyes widening as he saw me. "You okay, buddy?" he asked, his voice full of concern. I could barely get the words out. "There's something in the cabin," I managed to say, pointing back toward the woods. He gave me a strange look, like he wasn't sure if I was crazy or not, but he nodded, opening the passenger door. "Get in," he said. "Let's get you out of here." I climbed into the truck, slumping back against the seat, my entire body feeling like it had been drained of energy. As we drove away, I looked out the window, back toward the forest. For a moment, just before the trees swallowed the cabin from view, I thought I saw something, a dark figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us. Its eyes glinted yellow in the darkness. The driver must have noticed the way I was staring, because he cleared his throat. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, "people say there's strange things out here in these woods, things you wouldn't believe." He glanced at me, his eyes serious. Best not to go looking for him. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, my eyes still fixed on the forest until it disappeared from view. I never went back to that cabin. I left my gear, my paintings, everything. It wasn't worth it. Whatever was in that attic, whatever I saw that night, it was enough to make me realize that some places are better left alone. Sometimes the quiet isolation we crave has a price, and sometimes that price is far more than we're willing to pay. And now, every time I'm alone, working late into the night, I can't help but listen for it. That faint creak of a floorboard, the whisper of claws against wood, and I wonder if maybe, just maybe, it's still out there, waiting.